everyone. Thanks so much for coming. This is the second in the series of panels called Quarterly. We have an incredible list of speakers. I'm still stunned by the group we've assembled and incredibly grateful. Thank you as ever to Joseph Mosconi. The Poetic Research Bureau is such a special, magical place. It's a space of inquiry and creativity, and I'm really grateful to be able to stay here. And thank you to J.C. Gable, who is a publisher of Hat and Beard and now a bookseller with a loved one. He's selling copies of books by the panelists tonight, and I would really recommend picking up a copy since these are really incredible books. And again, this is a pretty new series, so feel free to reach out to me with comments, suggestions, panel ideas. I'm happy to hear it. There will be at least 3 more of these panels because that was my New Year's resolution, at least 4. So I'm very happy to get feedback. So tonight's topic is mimicking nature. I came across a quote in a 1975 interview with J.G. Ballard, which feels appropriate to introduce. So to quote, "The rules which govern the birth and life and decay of living systems don't apply in the realm of technology. A washing machine does not grow old gracefully. It still retains its youth, as it were, in bright chrome trim when it's been junked. You'll see these technological artifacts lying around like old corpses. In fact, their chrome is still bright." Now, I think on the panel tonight, we might have some thoughts that might be not aligned with that quote, but it might be interesting to at least kick it off. And so I'm going to also start the conversation with what is known as like the laziest way to start an essay, which is a definition from Oxford English Dictionary. And I just want to explain why I'm doing this, because I would never in a million years start an essay with the definition according to the Oxford English Dictionary of nature is, but the reason I am doing this is because it's a contested definition. So the OED definition of nature, just hear me out, I promise I'm going somewhere with this. The phenomenon of the physical world collectively, especially plants, animals, and other features and products of the earth itself, as opposed to humans and human creations. So last year, activists in the UK started a campaign to exclude the part that says in opposition. Their thinking is, how can humans begin to respect nature and work to protect it if they believe they're separate, something else, something in opposition? So I think this is very well aligned with our topic tonight, is like how human is nature to begin with, and from there, how do we talk about mimicking it? And centuries of Western thought, disciplines like architecture, computer science, urban planning, and so forth, surround us in ways that can feel unnatural or at least uncanny. And I wonder, from that definition, what does it mean that I often find myself yearning for nature if I'm already part of it? What's holding me back? So these are just some ideas to kick off tonight's discussion. Again, I'm so honored by our speakers tonight, including the legendary Katherine Hayles, who is author of several books, including How We Became Posthuman, and most recently, From Bacteria to AI, a provocative new framework for thinking about cognition across life forms and our artificial intelligence. And joining her to her right, the brilliant Yasaman Sheri, who is the principal investigator of synthetic Ecology's lab at the Serpentine Galleries, professor of media design practices at Art Center, and a research affiliate at NYU. And finally, Tom Comitta, author of what I believe is an absolute classic, and I think we're still going to be talking about this book in decades to come. It is that good, the Nature book. It's been a couple years, and I feel very strongly that this is one of those books that people are going to be turning back to. But also, they are the author of a new book called People's Choice Literature, the Most Wanted and Unwanted Novels, which they're also going to talk about tonight. And if you're around on Sunday, they will be presenting that book at Stories Bookshop, so I definitely recommend coming out. Oh, sorry, it's Tuesday. I'm sorry, it's Tuesday. Okay, sorry. Okay, I got the day. Tuesday, if you're around on Tuesday. So thank you again to the panelists. Kate, if you would like to begin.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Joanne for organizing this event tonight, and of course to all of you for coming. I hope we can have a lively conversation. So Joanne asked us to keep our initial remarks relatively brief so we can have a rousing discussion and lots of questions and comments. So tonight I'll be talking about my new book, Bacteria to AI. And I really started this book thinking about how I might contribute to the solving the environmental crises in which we're all plunged at the moment. And if we start thinking about the causes of this crises and why we've been so unable to mount an effective defense against them, we could list a number of sources: capitalism, political division, haves and have-nots. But the one that I chose to focus on are attitudes toward humans having cognitive superiority. So humans are not the most impressive species on the earth. We're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, we're probably not the prettiest, but all of those fall by the wayside because we congratulate ourselves that our cognition is superior to every other species. So we can build machines that are stronger than gorillas, that can run faster than cheetahs. So we make up for all of our deficiencies by having superior brains, or at least that's what we think. So if we want to begin to think about how we can remediate this attitude, which I identify with anthropocentrism, cognition would be a central intervention point. So I chose to focus on cognition for this book. And of course, to talk about cognition, I have to have a definition, not from the OED this time, but from one that I fabricated myself. So I define cognition as a process that interprets information within contexts that connect it to meaning. There are some big words in that definition: meaning, interpretation, but I'm going to make the case that all life forms have cognitive capabilities, even minimally cognitive systems like plants and microorganisms such as bacteria. So there's been a lot of recent work lately that makes the argument even a single cell has cognition. And if you think back to that definition of cognition, it's all about interpreting information from an environment. So a biologist at Tufts University, Michael Field, did an experiment in which he transplanted a tadpole's eye to its tail in embryo to see what would happen. And the tadpole managed to see through the eye by connecting to the brain through the spine. And so this shows the remarkable flexibility at a cellular level, even when the normal cellular networks have been completely disrupted. Another biologist has created what he calls xenobots. Xenobots are synthetic organisms created from excised frog skin cells. And he was able to show that these synthetic organisms, xenobots, can nevertheless find ways to navigate their environment. They can navigate through a curved tube. They can even scoop up other cells to form a larger aggregate. And so they take the cilia, which on the frog are used to distribute mucus over the frog's skin, and they repurpose that for movement in its environment instead. So while the frog skin cell is intact in the frog, it's part of a cellular network, and that cellular network suppresses some of its capabilities. But when it's excised from that network and made into its own independent organism, some of those suppressed abilities begin to be reactivated instead. So this suggests, and he argues in fact, that all life is teleological. Now, for a long time in biology, it was considered anathema to consider teleology, going all the way back to Darwin, who was fighting the idea that a divine creator created every organism with a purpose. And of course, he's trying to advance a theory of evolution as a counter argument to that idea. But now, currently, teleology is returning in the sense that all organisms seem to have an underlying purpose. And even at the simplest level, that purpose is defined by continuing their existence. So all organisms will strive to continue their existence, and in that sense, they have a teleological impulse. Well, the whole idea of the evolution was upended by this pioneer, Lynn Margulis. And Lynn Margulis had the idea that evolution was driven not by natural selection, or not primarily by natural selection, as Darwin had argued, but rather by symbiosis. So symbiosis is technically defined as two different species living in close proximity to one another. And Margulis's kind of foundational discovery was that way before humans had evolved, prokaryotic cells were invaded by another cell, which was then internalized to become the mitochondria of a new species, the eukaryotic cells. And the advantage of eukaryotic cells over prokaryotic cells was that they had a much greater energy potential. Consequently, they could fuel larger organisms. So all animal life depended on the evolution of eukaryotic cells. And if eukaryotic cells came into existence through a form of symbiosis called endosymbiosis, where one organism absorbs another and it continues to live within its host organism, then Margulis had a really strong argument. And subsequent research has in fact shown that the mitochondria of cells have a different DNA than the nucleus of cells, which validates her argument that they were originally two independently living species. So this new emphasis on symbiosis has led to a new appreciation of human life as comprised of collectivities of bacterial communities. So you may know that in the human body, most of the cells are non-human. In fact, by a factor of 10. The non-human cells are bacterial cells, viral cells, and so forth. But if you isolate all that, they're over 10 times more numerous than actual human cells. So people have argued, therefore, we should think of ourselves as holobionts. That is, as an organism that has living within us many other kinds of communities. So we are a collection of communities more than we are a single organism. So using some of these ideas, I developed the idea of technosymbiosis. So symbiosis, technically defined, as I mentioned, was two species living in close proximity, and usually they cooperate to their mutual benefit. But in biology, symbiosis also encompasses parasitism, where one species benefits at the expense of another. So I just want to introduce that idea that symbiosis has both a positive and a negative connotation. For technosymbiosis, the basic idea here is that since the beginning of the human species, humans have been in a tight feedback cycle with our technology. For example, prehistoric humans, when they learned to domesticate fire, changed their diet. And they changed their diet in such a way that it changed the formation of the jaw. And subsequently, those changes in the jaw facilitated the emergence of speech. Another example, prehistoric humans fabricated tools. Tools gave such a strong adaptive advantage that it accelerated bipedalism, and bipedalism, in a feedback loop, further accelerated the fabrication and the transport of tools. So that from the very beginning of our species, Homo sapiens evolved from a union between Homo habilis, our long ancestral forebears, to form Homo sapiens. In other words, Homo sapiens as a species came into existence with the technology that they created and that also created them. So now we're at a new phase in human history where beginning about 1950, we have invented computational media. And by computational media, I mean more than computers, I mean more than the internet, I mean routers, I mean fiber optic cables, microchips in your microwave, so on and so forth. So computational media is distinct from all the other technologies that humans have created because it's a cognitive technology. So if what makes humans special is our cognitive superiority, a claim I'm going to question in a minute, then to have a cognitive technology accelerates human evolution in a powerful, powerful rush. So think about this. If all of our computers crashed at midnight tonight, what would happen to the human species? Well, planes couldn't fly, supply lines would be disrupted, markets would run out of food, we couldn't have an electrical grid, and in fact, within a few months, there would be a massive die-off of the human species. So if two species are living close proximity with each other to their sometimes mutual benefit, they may become so closely entwined that they cannot survive without the other. So computational media has become our techno-symbiont. It has become so crucial to modern human life that most of the species could not survive without it. And now, of course, we're launching a new era with the invention of artificial intelligence, an even more highly cognitive system than computational media in general. So I mentioned that symbiosis as a technical term includes both benefits and risks. And of course, there are risks with computational media, even more serious risks with AI. It's not an unmixed picture. So to try to reevaluate human cognition within this larger picture that I've just been describing, I propose what I call the Integrated Cognitive Framework, or the ICF. And it emphasizes the relationality between human cognition and other kinds of cognizers, which would include all the living species on the earth. And it also includes cognitive media, especially AI. And the argument here is that most of the world's work now gets done through what I call cognitive assemblages. These are collectivities that include humans, technical artifacts, and in some cases, other biological non-human species as well. But think about it. Everything we do involves an assemblage rather than merely humans. You go home tonight, you open up your computer, you get on the web, you go to your social media site. Well, all that is done through an assemblage. Your computer, and all the other equipment that enables your computer to run. Anything you do practically nowadays is done through a cognitive assemblage. So now we'll move on to another concept of the Umwelt. This is a German word that could be usually translated as world surround or world horizon. And it was first proposed by Jakob von Uexküll in the 19th century, a German biologist. And Uexküll's point was relatively simple. It's that every species constructs its own reality through its particular physiology, neurology, biology, and so forth. So as humans, we live within the human Umwelt. Uexküll's favorite example was a tick that he kept imprisoned under a glass on his desk. And the tick has cannot see, the tick cannot hear. All the tick can do is smell, but one of the things that it smells is butyric acid, which is a chemical secreted by mammals. So when it smells butyric acid, it drops down onto a mammal and sucks blood, and that's its life cycle. So if you think about a tick, how a tick constructs its world, it would be radically different than how humans construct our world. So the point is, every species constructs its own world, and this is beautifully illustrated, through Ed Young's book, An Immense World, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us. So this is a wonderful book. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And what Young does is to show the vast variety through which different species on the earth construct their world. Now, one of the implications, the deeper implications of the Umwelt, is that we can never know reality as it is. We only know reality as we construct it. And humans are unique among species in having all these other instruments that extend our Umwelt. But finally, we have telescopes, we have microscopes, and so on and so forth. But finally, all that information is interpreted through human brains and human thoughts. So we're always within our Umwelt, and every time we talk about the laws of nature, we should have a little footnote, the laws of nature as we experience nature. And experience here, I mean in that extended sense of all the information that our instruments can bring to us. So now let's go to large language models. As a literary critic, I'm fascinated by this generative AI. And I'd like to suggest that LLMs, large language models, also have an Umwelt, just as humans have an Umwelt. It overlaps with the human Umwelt, but it is significantly different from the human Umwelt. So for humans, we engage through the world with our sensory and motor capacities. LLMs have no capacity to sense their actual physical environment, but they have what we might call their conceptual Umwelt through the billions of human texts that they read and ingest. For humans, language is acquired through communication with others, but through LLMs, language is understood through mathematical abstractions. Humans are conscious. We narrate selfhood continuously. LLMs have no emotions. We have emotions modulated through our limbic system. We have only limited memory and processing power, and LLMs, of course, have billions of data points, and they analyze, draw correlations, and operate between them. So with this, I'm going to conclude my brief remarks, and I'd be glad to elaborate on any of these points in discussion. Among them, the literary implications of reading literature produced by LLMs and literature read by LLMs. So now I'll turn it over to Yasaman.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So I am going to present a little bit different style, but I will speak to some of my work. Hi, my name is Yasaman Sheri. I'm a designer, and I've been trained in design, and I kind of found myself as a researcher and a writer. But I always come back to this idea of my practice is not noun-based, it's verb-based. So I like to ask questions, I design and build platforms, I seek creative inquiry and imagination, I write to process, and I lead through inspiration. And I have a curiosity-driven practice, which you'll see that my design practice has got me to very interesting spaces that a traditional designer wouldn't have. And I work on tools that explore life sciences and ecology. I'm just gonna pull this a little bit more forward. So this is kind of how I like to see myself, and it's my practice. But the core of what I constantly come back to is how to shift our perspective and consider new ways of seeing. I think this is the core of how we begin to maybe imagine the things that we're building. As a designer, I build things all the time. I have teams that build things all the time, so that perspective is really important to me. You might be surprised to find that I actually do have built a lot of things that many people have used, and most of it is advanced technologies, working with tech companies that have been very much co-opted by people that maybe I don't necessarily align with politically. So I think for me, it's not just interesting, because I've always been interested in the philosophy of technology. I've also been very interested in building it, because I want to be part of the creation of it. So for the last 15 years, I've built a lot of different operating systems for devices that may or may not exist in 10 or 20 years. This is just a trial. But I think they're interesting because they have a lot of sensors and they sense the world. Now, I'll come back to this in a second so you'll know what I mean. As I began to learn about the sensing technologies that these devices have, a lot of them using machine learning, and more recently a lot of LLMs, to kind of not only perceive the world through these kind of sensors that understand the world, but also to process what they mean. And we're giving it kind of like an understanding from our perspective. And I want to move beyond this idea of designed in California, made in China, and kind of make it a little bit more inclusive and bring my own perspective. And my team is a diverse team of perspectives into it, which brought me to teaching and building a lot of prototypes, imagining things beyond corporate environments and industry environments into kind of more critical spaces. I have taught at CIID, Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design, and now I teach at Art Center, where we are looking at kind of more critical parts of technology in relation to everyday practices. With my students, not only I ask them to kind of build, explore technologies in ways that maybe we don't experience it today and might be kind of niche or might be from their own diverse perspectives, but also extend beyond the kind of physical matter. So a lot of this leads into a lot of biological interactions. So here, my students are doing a smell walk or writing about smells, looking with molecules. I take them out to a lot of different spaces just to break their brain a little bit. I feel like that's my job. And for example, if you talk about biotechnology or genetically modified organisms, that's like, there's a lot of feelings there. So we go to a biotech, lab, or I might take them to a zero waste kitchen, or I might take them here, it's the fermentation lab at Noma in Denmark. So there's all these different perspectives that they get to encounter, and at the end they get to work with the materials and work as kind of creative practitioners in the space. So that is my education and curriculum, building novel curriculums, but also in my own practice, as I kind of began to build with a lot of sensors and imagine what sensing looks like, I began to ask the question, how come sensing, we don't talk about sensing around biology. I sense a lot of things. So I became interested in biological sensors, not just the device sensors. And the biological sensors, I had a residency at Ginkgo Bioworks, where I actually was embedded among scientists to kind of deep dive into what is a biological sensor. And so here I explored a lot of different proteins, which biological sensors are essentially proteins that get to sense molecules. And turns out there's so many kinds of them living inside existing organisms. So there's like smell sensors, there's taste sensors, there's like spicy flavor, there is, smoke, and so on. So this was really interesting to me, and I wanted to bring it back into my own kind of visual practice. So here we're embedding a lot of these sensors inside different materials. Here's paper, as I was inspired by kind of litmus tests and so on. Coming back to this drawing, this photo, I really loved what you said about symbiosis and the idea of kind of parasitic. I often think about who is having a parasitic experience with me. But in this case, we put two different microbial life inside a petri dish, where we actually worked with them to kind of embed a new form of sensing. So on one side, we put yeast, and the yeast was able to produce a molecule that smelled. So the smell of rose, or the smell of daisy, or a smell of something like mint. On the other side of the petri dish, we put an E. coli where we actually embedded it with a biological sensor. So actually it sensed the actual molecule. So here is an actual interaction happening at a molecular level inside this petri dish. Now this was really abstract for me. I got to be in the lab and work with scientists, but I wanted to bring it back to kind of the more human scale. And I think this is the part where the designer in me is coming in and interested in this work. But also, I like to kind of document, experiences that I get to have through the scientific learning, because I don't know the scientific words, and I'm not a scientist or a scientific practitioner, but I'm curious about the way we see things. So here is Biosphere 2. I'm really interested in simulations, and I see this space as a simulation of ecology, and I was really interested in it. And so a lot of my practice is a practice of collecting, understanding, and engaging and asking questions around biology. Here is a project, for example, where I deep dived into extremophiles, which are essentially microbial life that are microorganisms that live in very, very extreme environments. So for example, really acidic or really hot or really cold. Turns out we have microbes in Antarctica. We have microbes in the desert. There's life everywhere. And I love what you said about life, but also right before that, wherever there is water, there is life. So I think that's something interesting to think about. But I also like to work with, our LLMs and AI and build different ways that we can even see our own ideas of what is life. I'll keep it short, but currently I do a lot of different things. But one of the things that I do is that I lead a lab, essentially science and art collaboration lab at Serpentine Galleries. And here, one of our projects, our first project, was really wanting to build lists and wanting to build aggregation and curation. And so I brought in a few different people from very different backgrounds, a chef, a microbiologist, a writer, so many different people of different kinds, someone who works in the lab, someone who works with materials, and we built what I call the Synthetic Ecologist Compendium. And the first season was about microbial life. I highly recommend everyone to check it out. You can just type in Synthetic Ecologist Compendium, and it's a resource for anyone to be able to kind of learn about microbial life in all these different ways that might be around sensory intimacy, or we call this one cellular trompe-l'oeil, which is kind of like trick of the eye, where we begin to build like different materials that look biologically similar. And this project was really kind of bringing communities of people around the idea of fermentation, because fermentation today is not only in the kitchen, that happens with your yogurt and with your pickles, but also scientists are using the same process of fermentation in laboratories to build new materials that maybe might not be plastic or might not be rubber and so on. And that fermentation is essentially microbes brewing inside like a vat. So I think it's the same process, and so we wanted to open up the space and make it more accessible. Last but not least, unlike the very accomplished people around me, I have not published a book, but my writing does exist in many different magazines and books, and I do try to constantly talk about this eco-techno creative kind of critical space often with the goal of shifting the perspective of how we get to view things. And the latest one is called Royal Chambers, which was a collaboration with a few different collaborators and friends of mine. And here I wrote this article, which I think is relevant to tonight's topic, is about called Microbial Home, Our Networks of Metabolisms, which I love the idea of holobot. And I think here, for me, in the essay, and I'd love to share it with anyone who's interested, I talk a lot about the problematic word, non-human, and even people have tried to make it a little bit better, more than human, but always there's this human in the center of the word. And I think naming is really, really important, how we get to perceive the world, how we get to see the world. So here I talk a lot about the tree of life and how we've put ourselves at the very top in Western scientific European thinking, but a lot of indigenous knowledge doesn't think that way. And so even the word non-human itself is very human-centric. So in this essay, I talk a lot about that. And that's kind of a little bit about me. I do a lot of different things, as you can tell, but I'm really excited to talk to you all and have a really lively discourse around this topic. And I'm gonna pass it to, okay.
Hello? Oh, cool. Hi. Thank you, Joanne and Joseph and Poetic Research Bureau, and yeah, thank you for your presentations. Oh, is it we're out of order? Oh, no, cool. Yes, so the reason I was invited is I wrote this book called The Nature Book, and basically this book, this is out of order a little bit, this is the cover. This book is a novel made entirely out of nature descriptions from 300 other novels. And so I turned all of that language into a text that you would think is unreadable, but some people have said is a page turner. I'll get into it in a second, but basically that project began, so I started out as a poet, and then I befriended this artist, Kota Ozawa, who's a Bay Area-based animator, artist of many types. This is a still from a video of his from 2010 called City of Nature. And before this video, everything he had done was, at least at the time that I saw this, I saw his work as basically dealing with visual representations of violence in American culture. There were, murder trials, brawls at sporting events, assassinations of presidents. And then he did this video that was just nature shots from feature-length movies. And you got, this is, I think, the sea from Swept Away. This is the river of Fitzcarraldo. I have no idea what this is. A shot, basically he made a kind of supercut of maybe 40 nature shots from feature-length movies, and then did his signature rotoscoping technique, where he essentially flattened the nature in this way. And as you can see here, it makes it pretty abstract at times. And so because his work had been thinking through violence a lot, and this work was so benign, the only potentially scary thing is this shark fin that then goes away. I couldn't help but think that he was pointing to something pernicious about the process of framing and flattening life into images. And he asked me to give a reading at an event of his, and I thought to try something similar with fiction. And I made a poem, basically, that was collaging nature descriptions from other novels. Halfway through it, I said, oh my goodness, it needs to take the form that I'm drawing from, a novel, and I had to figure out how to write a novel. And that's what this is. And so I spent a year going through hundreds of EPUBs collecting nature descriptions, and at the end of that year, I had this residency at the Bemis Center in Omaha, in Nebraska, And I just spent the summer cutting it up and then organizing it. And so essentially, every table there became a section of this book. So the book is essentially like the 4 seasons. It goes fall, winter, spring, and then basically summer is the rest of the book. We have oceans, islands, jungles, outer space, prairies, mountains, and deserts. So it kind of is an archive of how people have written in English. I was interested in kind of, it's all realism, so pushing, like translation seemed like a remove. At the time, the next supercut is like from all languages, but I'm also interested in maybe somebody trying, if somebody did it in a different language, would other landforms and animals appear? Because essentially, kind of like AI, and some people have called me human AI for doing this, you know, it's kind of mapping patterns in how we speak through, project into, and distort nature into narratives. And of course, usually in the background. Here it's brought to the fore. And so actually, in keeping with some of the observations of everybody up here thus far, the big observation I had was that more often than not, when we write about nature, we're writing about people. Because these nature descriptions are always connected to some like lamentation, or, you know, it's raining when it's difficult in a story, or, you know, the punch lands right as the lightning flashes, you know. We can get more into what I found, but that's the general observation. It's also a fun book. It gets a little silly. You know, you put a bunch of ridiculous spring language together, and it's this kind of disgustingly positive, gushing moment. And there's even a sound poem. And then, oh yeah, so this is, yeah, how that was written. So each table was like, you know, winter language, etc. Oh yeah. After I put this out, I was like, I think I should just do nonfiction now. And I thought up this project that was kind of based on George Kuchar's The Weather Diaries, where he went to the Great Plains during tornado season and stayed in a motel and just documented his experiences being there and the experience of everyone else like waiting for their lives to be destroyed. I'd been interested in channeling that in some way for years, and then I like moved to New York and realized that I wanted to go back to Death Valley, which I'd gone to a lot when I lived here. I now live here again. It's complicated. Anyway, I decided to go to Death Valley at the hottest time of the year and document heat tourism, which I had never experienced. When I lived here, I'd only go in January, because that's the smart time to go. No, I found nobody should be there during the summer. That's kind of the thesis that led me from becoming a journalist to, as you see, a protester here. Basically, I figured out how you survive for a week. I was, you know, I had a hotel, so I was not out but I did learn about, you know, hydration, you know, how to not die outside for long periods of times. I'm in full UPF gear here, which no one else in the valley was wearing. Anyway, long story short, I basically found that my thesis was that the entire park was designed idiotically, pushing people, especially during the summer, to the hottest point, whereas since time immemorial, before the white settlers arrived, nobody was in Death Valley during the summers. Everybody who lived there, the indigenous people, would leave the valley and go up to Wild Rose Canyon, which is really beautiful and like 40 degrees cooler in the summer, so sustainable. That combined with some the worker conditions there were quite bad, and then just learning that the national park was going to have a 5K run on the day that the world was supposed to reach a heat record, I risked not getting paid by the publication that had paid me to go, and I created this protest where I found this this Happy Birthday stuff and remixed it into Happy Death Day, and a lot of people tried to fight me for an hour as I sang the Happy Birthday song while basically recounting what I had learned. Anyway, basically that's related because, one last thing I'll just say about this, I was like, why I would have also come to this apart from just Kota making a video is that as a kid, I was like raised an environmentalist. My mother, every year for her birthday, it was before recycling was everywhere, at least in southern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, and they would collect recycling for a year, and on her birthday we would like recycle. That was the thing. So anyway, it's in my blood. It's relevant. Joanne asked me to talk about this. And then this is only slightly related. This most wanted, most unwanted. If this is mimicking nature, this is maybe mimicking human nature or American human nature as determined by a public opinion poll. I made this public opinion poll about fiction. Everything from what's your favorite genre to setting to character to verb tense, experimental, traditional. And I worked with a survey design expert, and we polled the United States. I then took the data and wrote the most wanted novel with everything people wanted, and the most unwanted with everything that got 0 or no votes. And you might have heard Komar and Melma did this with paintings in the 90s, and then Dave Soldier did this with music in the 90s. It was the music album where I realized I wanted to write the most unwanted novel. Anyway, so essentially the most wanted is a thriller or mystery, and the most unwanted is this kind of like genre goulash of romance, horror, historical fiction, and classic literature. It's set on Mars 100 years in the future, where basically the billionaires of today live forever and leave us all here to burn, which is, of course, not so unrealistic to think. And it's about these like 160-year-old aristocratic tennis players. There's talking animals. There's a collection of horror stories halfway through. It's mostly in the second person. Here's some other infographics I made. Some relevant data. People don't really want to read about the environment compared to science and technology and everything above it. I also found it was interesting that 90% of Americans want at least some violence. And of course, only 4% want a lot of violence. But anyway, this is my... Okay, anyway, and we're doing this event on June 3rd at Stories If You're Around. Yeah. And this is a scene from The Most Unwanted. Okay. Kind of.
Oh, thanks so much, everyone, for really amazing presentations. I just have a few questions for the panel before, we could do that. Before we move to Q&A, and also just so you know, we'll be hanging out at the bar for a little bit after the conversation ends, so feel free to chat with any of us if you want to continue the conversation. But so my first question, Kate, I noticed early in the book you write, living creatures have stakes in what happens to them, whereas material processes do not. And this feels like a critical difference. I wondered if you might elaborate, especially because it seems like it would relate to what you say later in the book about literary depictions of AI, if that's correct.
Okay, thanks for that question. So the background for this question is really a movement within literary and cultural studies called new materialism, which you may have heard about. And one of the typical books from that movement is Jane Bennett's Vital Materialism, Vital Matter. And so the argument is that non-living, the line between living and non-living things is arbitrary and artificial, and that matter has agency. So used to be thought that matter was inert, matter doesn't move by itself. Well, now we know that matter can be lively in all kinds of ways. But it seemed important to me to make a distinction between the kind of agency emerging from physical processes, physical and chemical processes, and the kind of agency that living organisms have. So an avalanche has tremendous agency, an agency that dwarfs anything humans can do. A tornado has agency. A thunderstorm has agency. It makes things happen. But what physical processes cannot do is perform interpretations and make choices. So a tornado cannot choose to go through a field rather than a populated town. An avalanche can't choose to wait until the climbers are off the slope, and so on and so forth. But organisms do make choices and do perform interpretations. Now, I recently read a fascinating book by Laura Tripaldi called Parallel Lives. Tripaldi is a nanotechnologist, and she was talking about the ways that smart matter can be engineered to have many of the qualities of life, like metabolism, for example, like the ability to sense its environment. And so it's clear that the line between the living and the non-living is ambiguous, and it may even be moving as a result of developments like nanotechnology. Nevertheless, I still think it's important to make that distinction between rocks eroding, lakes evaporating, and even microorganisms moving, because microorganisms will always act in such a way as to continue their existence. That separates them from lakes and rocks and mountains sliding down. So thank you for that question, Joanne. But your second part of your question.
The second part of my question is, I wondered if that might relate to what you were saying about depictions of AI and what you wrote about these depictions of AI in fiction and literary works. Because that literature is work that depicts stakes and characters in conflict. Perhaps it didn't, I don't know. I was wondering if there was a connection there, but if you might want to talk about those books and your thoughts on them.
Yeah, just be very brief, because I know there are lots of other things we'd like to talk about. But recently I've been reading a lot of novels and poems and essays written by LLMs. It may be that LLMs create a technological equivalent to emotion. I wouldn't rule that out of court. It's a possibility, at least a theoretical possibility, but they certainly have emotions only secondhand insofar as they've gleaned them from the billions of human-authored texts that they've read. So take something as crucial to a novel as the narrative arc, defined by Aristotle thousands of years ago, but still practiced by every potboiler that you ever read. And that is, the narrative arc consists of a beginning, a middle, and an end. The purpose of the beginning is to gauge emotions. The purpose of the middle is to complicate emotion. And the purpose of the end is to resolve emotions. Consequently, narrative is a technology to manipulate human emotions. So what does a narrative arc mean to an LLM who has no emotions? It means absolutely nothing. And so many of the AI-created novels that I've read have no narrative arc. They have no coherence that we would recognize as a story. They're radically disjunctive. So there are two ways you could look at this. One is that AIs write really bad fiction. The other way you can look at it is that this is a new form of creativity operating according to an entirely new aesthetic. An aesthetic that is not human-oriented, but AI-oriented. And the possibility that there exists something like an LLM aesthetic really fascinates me. And in fact, that's the topic that I'm currently engaged in writing on. So I'll pass it back to you, Joanne.
Oh. Okay. Well, yeah. So this book uses a little bit of AI, and the only reason I bring it up is that the reason I felt comfortable, I'd used it. I was working with it before ChatGPT came out. There was this playground, this open AI playground, and the reason I felt comfortable doing it or interested was that this fiction writer, theorist Elvia Wilk had written this essay about kind of what you were getting at right there. She was critiquing the idea, why do we need it to sound like humans? Isn't it more interesting or fruitful to figure out, like, what can it do that we can't do, or what could it create art that is just beyond that? And to my experience thus far, most of the creative versions that I found have been people trying to use it to make things that seem like human. And so I guess I'd also just be curious, have there been things that are letting it go kind of more free? I mean, because it's not doing a totally great job, fully mimicking it in a way that everyone wants to sit down and read a whole book. Whatever I used here, I had to edit heavily. It was pretty tinny, the language. But at least back then, before ChatGPT came out, it did some weird stuff that I totally kept in. Like, it was repeating things in ways that it was glitching, and that felt, at least to me at the time, like its voice was its glitching. Yeah. But I feel like we're trying to get it to not glitch. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, I find this kind of interesting because also, sorry. Oh, I see. Maybe I'll. Thank you. I find this kind of interesting too because LLMs are not this like other thing. Like, they are literally a manifestation of like all the data that we're feeding it. So I think like we really need to also think about what data we're feeding into the LLM as someone who works with it on a daily basis. So I think if you feed it certain, I kind of want to think about the internet for a second. Like, if you think of the internet as like the feeding of the LLM, the internet is kind of biased. It's very biased. If you look at Wikipedia, it's extremely biased, So I think a lot of the things that it's being fed are going to regurgitate a lot of the things that we ourselves are putting on the internet. So if I think about the early moments of the internet and how it allowed for people in physical society who didn't have access to certain things, it was allowing folks to break boundaries of culture, of expectations. And I can imagine like a teenager in a basement who's able to like go on a website and put whatever they want in places where maybe they wouldn't be able to physically. I'm curious about LLMs and AI becoming that and like allowing for these niche spaces and what you mentioned, the element of surprise to come back and become this creative practice of like, because really what I think creativity is like connecting dots that wouldn't have otherwise been connected. And so if it can allow you to do that, that's beautiful. But then my concern and my worry is that if we're feeding it the same old things and the same structures of power, the same structures of thinking, then I'm concerned that we're just gonna repeat like this mirrored effect of like what of ourselves are, and all the same power structures, all the same problems that we have in society is just going to continue to reflect. So that's just a little bit of my perspective.
Great, thank you. I have a question for the group because one of the shared themes in all of your work is the idea of the harms of anthropocentrism and putting the human before environments, ecologies, and animals. And I just wondered if we could maybe speak about what these harms are, because I feel like each of you might have a different point of view on what is harmful about anthropocentrism. Would anyone like to begin? Or the harms of anthropocentrism and putting the human above everything else, because that's a theme that came up in everyone's work in your presentations as well, and I wondered if you might speak about some of the specificity of harms, especially things that we might not think about ordinarily.
Yeah, well, the specificities of the harms caused by anthropocentrism are enormous, in my opinion. But let me just take one small segment of that, and that's the way that we treat other species on the earth. So we can start with our domestic animals. You know, why is it that we love our dogs and we kill our cows? The whole idea of rights that animals might have is a hot mess, a legal mess and a cultural mess. No way does our treatment of our other domestic species make any kind of sense. Not to speak about our treatment of other species like forests, for example. I was very moved by Richard Powers' novel Overstory, which is about the relation between human communities and forests. And he makes such a powerful case that forest ecologies are cognitive, that they respond, that they understand their relationships with humans in radically different ways than we understand our relations with them. And just to imagine a forest as a cognitive entity in his novel causes a kind of revolution of thought. There's a Midwestern farmer that's fascinated by a chestnut tree that grows up to a majestic height that's the only chestnut tree for thousands of miles, which explains why it was able to escape the blight that killed all the East Coast chestnut trees. And the farmer dedicates himself to taking a photograph of this tree every month for his entire life, and then he passes the task on to his son, who also takes a photograph of the tree every month, and they compile this in an album. And the son is looking at it, and the father says to the son, "Makes you think different, don't it?" And that's kind of like the whole message of the book. Makes you think different, don't it? And that's what I would hope to accomplish, and that's what I hope my book does. But I'm, of course, only part of a much larger movement, and I hope this movement takes off and really has an impact.
That's so beautiful. I think making you think differently about nature is probably one of the most important things we can do for the climate absolute disaster that we're facing right now. I really loved what you said about the differences between how we view, for example, a cat and a cow. And I think we have these perspectives of nature that is like, nature is in this box that's green, that's like, doesn't question my power, doesn't challenge my sense of control. And I want to tell a little story. I'm a surfer, and I engage with water a lot. So I see a lot of species in the water. I'm constantly around water. When the fires happened, it really affected the water. So it's just like there's like a connection to land that I perceive that maybe if you're not in water, you don't. And a year and a half ago, I was stung by a stingray, which really traumatized me, and it really made me question the relationship with living things. And as it was extremely traumatizing, so I tried to write about it and just kind of process it. But I think we have to. I think we like to do this binary thing where we like to glorify nature and say, oh, like it's green, it's beautiful. Oh, it's desert, it's empty. This binary, but I think we have to also imagine that the species that we want to consume, or the species that are living in these spaces, like Long Beach, is full of stingray. It turns out it's the stingray capital of the world. And when it actually stung me and the venom was inside my body, I had a lot of feelings around, this relationship that I'm having, that I'm embarking on its home, and, I'm kind of trespassing in some ways into its home. So I think there's a level of empathy that we sometimes drop for certain species and want to highlight for other species that I think is really interesting, that I think maybe sometimes we should imagine the kind of empathy we have for other human beings too. So I think the same thinking that we have of the hierarchy we have among other humans, we are embedding into other species as well. And this hierarchy is deeply, deeply damaging, to come back to the Anthropocene.
I don't know how much more, you all covered that very well. I guess at least at the level of what do we do where we're at now, I think a lot, being my world is mostly storytelling. There was this book, The Uninhabitable Earth, that came out around the time, maybe 2022. And one of the things that David Wallace Wells talks about, he horrifies you, and that's, I guess, why it was controversial or something. But there's this question of, he makes this argument that basically we need stories, and that we should try every kind of storytelling. I believe he basically says we need like a Pearl Harbor of an ecological disaster. I mean, we had that basically here. We've had that several times. We had that here earlier this year. But like, it's out of the news cycle, unless if you lived through it. I have friends who are still living through it, but it's not in the news. Anyway, I think, essentially, I'm still curious about how narrative can help with that, because, having written a book that is pushing against anthropocentrism, it's almost like anti-anthro in a way, although, if you read it, there's so many references to people. It's difficult now, after that, having written a book with humans and thinking about it, like, we need, like, it seems that as people, we have to read about ourselves. Like, as I said, when we're writing about nature, we're writing about ourselves. Like, we need a mirror. I don't know how we break out of it. I mean, maybe this thinking, but, any movie, anything, it's like even any animals are anthropomorphized. And so, basically, I have more of a question than an observation or an answer, or like, it seems that this is relevant to some of these things.
No, questions are always welcome, including right now from the audience. If anyone has, do we have, I have time for a few, and I see right in the front, just a moment.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much to all the panelists. And my question is for Dr. Hayles. And also thank you for all your work. It's been tremendously inspiring for me over the years. So in your presentation, you begin with bracketing off capitalism and political divisions and other causes of the climate crisis before discussing attitudes toward human cognitive superiority. And in thinking about the possibilities of integrated cognitive frameworks of the Umwelten that might emerge between humans and computational media, I'm wondering what happens when something like capitalism is not bracketed off. Because it seems to me that the driving force behind so many cognitive assemblages today is capital accumulation, right? So I'm curious about that decision, and what would happen when capitalism entered the conversation?
Thanks, that's a great question. And there's a wonderful book about nature and capitalism that I would recommend to you. And the argument of the book essentially is that by making a separation between nature and culture, we have inadvertently allowed capitalism to take all the real costs of capitalist development off the balance sheet. So we don't talk about the damage to the environment when looking at a techno companies' profits, for example. So you take all the all the hidden costs into account, you get a very different accounting than if they're not allowed to be considered. So that you get this reversal. Are you talking about nature in capitalism? Or are you talking about capitalism in nature? If you're talking about nature in capitalism, you've already arranged the balance sheet such that most of the real costs are hidden. On the other hand, if you talk about capitalism within nature, you get a completely different picture. So I completely agree with you that there's a lot of important work to be done in that regard, and also with the fact that AI is being developed mostly by large tech companies. And so they are obviously interested in the bottom line and making a profit. They have to be in order to continue their endeavors. So there's a lot to write about that. It's just that that's not my, I don't feel necessarily well equipped to address that myself, but I'm extremely interested in those kinds of critiques, and I think they are extremely valuable.
Yeah. I think one thing that's really bizarre in this conversation is that the amount of computation that AI needs is like very damaging to Earth. So there's something kind of funny here where I think we do need to maybe address that at some point, because, you know, computation isn't this like thing that's happening in the air. It's like very physical. It's extremely physical. There's like cooling systems that are actively trying to make sure that the computation that's happening to answer your LLM, inquiries, to be done in a way that isn't, going to overheat the server, essentially. So I think I feel like we're reaching in computation some point where we're gonna have to address the climate. So I'm really curious about that personally. Yeah, just wanted to make that point.
And now you can't, states can't force any regulation of AIs if this bill passes, right? So to try to, I guess that would mean to try to get them to stop doing that.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. This has been a great. I really appreciate this talk. Thank you. First of all, when you were Dr. Hayles, and were you talking about Michael Levin? When you were talking about Michael Field?
Oh, yeah.
Was it?
The person who is doing the work on xenobots is Michael Levin. Michael Field is also working with the tadpoles, as I mentioned, but the xenobots are done by Michael Levin.
Okay.
Levin.
I think I hadn't heard of Michael Field, but I've watched a lot of YouTube videos of Michael Levin. Because YouTube is where I get all my information.
What Michael Fields is doing is trying to develop a system where you don't talk about microorganisms in terms of signs, but you talk about them in terms of reference frames. So he's sort of pushing against the whole tradition of biosemiotics, where you develop a semiotics where you can talk about non-human organisms. And in fact, those are all the slides I skipped in my presentation. But what Michael Field is trying to do is to not use a semiotic approach where you talk about signs, but rather you talk about the kind of internal reference frame a microorganism evolves in relation to the environment. That may seem totally opaque. I apologize.
No. I maybe I can get it. I couldn't find him online in the brief moment I attempted to secretly Google him as you were talking. So but I'll ask about it later. Okay, this was in I don't know how well I can articulate this. When you're talking about a tornado versus the teleology of a living organism or an organism with agency. I had one thought, I suppose in the form of a question. I like the sort of ambivalence with which the moderator brought up the Oxford English Dictionary defines, living things, blah, blah, blah. I sort of was wondering how we define superiority, like what, what's the definition of superiority you're talking about when you're talking about cognitive superiority in humans.
You mean how I would define cognitive superiority?
Yeah, like versus cognitive difference. Like how do we,
Yeah.
the way I sometimes look at humans is something's going on. Like we're having struggles and we think we have agency, but we're sort of like a tornado. We're sort of like a tornado that thinks, and we're blowing through shit, and there's a lot of living organisms within a tornado with their own teleologies, but the tornado is causing a lot of destruction. So how much are we responsible? How much aren't we? And what's, those are some.
Yeah, I think your point is very well taken. So, if we were to talk about the cognitive superiority of humans, Terence Deacon has made the argument several years ago that what's unique about the human species is our ability to form symbolic abstractions. Symbolic abstractions are the basis of language, they're the basis of mathematics, they're the basis of digital computation, and that no other species can perform acts of abstraction such as humans have done. Humans are the only species that can send a rocket to Mars. Humans are the only species that can invent computers. Humans are the only species that can write symphonies. Humans are the only species that can develop mathematical proofs. Okay, let's grant all that. In the midst of all of this cognitive superiority, why is it that humans are driving the planet to ecological collapse? This is what I call the cruel conundrum. Humans are the only species that can intervene effectively in our present ecological crises, and humans are the ones that are causing it. So you could call this our cognitive stupidity. There's our cognitive superiority on the one hand, and there's cognitive stupidity on the other hand. And at the basis of cognitive stupidity is the inability to overcome self-interest in the service of a larger planetary interest. And of course, capitalism is one of the primary economic structures responsible for that very development. But it's obvious to me, and I think to most people who think seriously about this question, that the kind of ecological problems we have now cannot be solved at the national level because they're global in nature. If you release a poison cloud of gas, it's going to float in the atmosphere globally. It's not going to stay in whatever region released it. So we have all of these global problems. It seems so obvious. Why can't we do this? Why can't we move from a nation-based political structure to planetary structures? Planetary structures are what we need in order to be able to address these questions. So now you have to convince nations to give up some degree of their sovereignty in order to give real power to planetary structures that can actually address these problems effectively. Is that so hard to do? Well, yeah, it's proving to be almost impossible to do. But that seems like the obvious next move that is at the root of our cognitive stupidity.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question around complexity versus superiority. I think superiority in nature is stupidity, if you ask me, because I honestly, I'm really not sure that we can do that given the way that the globe is like building boundaries that are so, I don't know, the boundaries that are set towards geopolitics, like Catherine was mentioning, makes no sense ecologically at all because there is no boundaries like that. I personally wonder about your question in the context of selfishness, and at some point I don't think we can afford that anymore, because it's coming back to us. One of the things that I'm really interested in is toxicity, and the way that capitalism is kind of coming back, haunting us within our bodies, within not just oceans and all the living ecologies, but also our own bodies. And I think disease and toxicity are going to be another form of backlash that we're going to see ecologically, and all the kind of toxic everything that we're putting in nature. So I think, yeah, it's a great question, and I want to propose that we begin to think about superiority not just between humans and other species, but also humans among humans, because that's really the core of where this superiority complex is coming from. It's this like Western way of thinking of like certain cultures, certain groups are more than others, then we bring that onto other species, which a lot of indigenous people did not do. So I'm curious about that, yeah.
Can I say one brief thing? It's a left field thing that is completely irrelevant to anything, almost anything has been said since. And I won't say much about it, but we could talk later. I also get the feeling that I feel like part of the superiority, or like one of the problems, is that we have that many of us, a large part of the Western culture, has like no spiritual connection to nature anymore. And I think that that is a larger conversation, as I said, completely irrelevant to any of the technological things we've just been discussing, but I think that's a problem.
All right, we have one more question.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Hayles primarily, and I apologize if this is something that you've elucidated on in your book. I haven't gotten a chance to read it. First of all, I'd just like to say that it is very much so appreciated hearing all of this sort of like understanding of different scientific definitions that I feel like are very much so hammered into us from a young age in like very rigid terms, coming from a linguist, coming from like a linguistic perspective, and just sort of like calling into question the way that those things are defined to us. And going off of that, I'm very interested in your idea of technosymbiosis, just because something that really struck me is the way that you were sort of describing it as being like a codependent relationship, which I found very interesting because, you know, the way that we're normally taught about symbiosis between organisms is something that occurs on like a biological level in terms of like literally like biological codependency. Whereas just because pretty much all technological advancements that could probably fall under like what you're describing have occurred in such like a small blip of history that it's like our biology has had no time to catch up to that kind of thing. So what I'm essentially sort of asking is, you know, since we don't have that sort of biological dependency on technology yet, like in the sense that we may be dependent on technology, but like say if the people that survived like a total technological collapse had children, those children would not have any kind of like innate dependency on any kind of technology because it wouldn't be born into them. I'm just wondering like what this sort of classification, like what its benefits are in your eyes, like understanding it via that sort of like system of like dependency between like humans and technology, as opposed to what we're sort of fighting up against, which was natural selection as like a modality for like categorizing what life means, if that makes any sense. And I can try to explain that more. I'm not sure if I can, but do you understand what I mean?
I think I grasped the essence of your question. So I might start by pointing out that there are cultures and societies on the earth where if computational media crashed, they would be just fine. I mean, think about tribal areas in Africa, for example. So I should qualify all of those comments by saying the more a society depends on the technological transfer of information, the more it's going to be affected by computational media. Recognizing that there are cultures and populations on the earth that don't depend on that at all. Others depend on it in a very stratified way. For example, cell phones are tremendously important in Indian villages in India. Computers, not so much. So we have a very uneven picture of development in the earth. But I think it's actually more complex than saying we only depend on computational media culturally, not biologically. Because we actually do depend on technology biologically. Think about modern medicine. Think about modern lifespans compared to those of prehistoric humans. You know, prehistoric humans were lucky if they lived to age 30. Now we have lifespans in the 70s and in the 80s. So we do depend on technology biologically. But I think your point is, if you were completely devoid of technology, could you survive as a biological organism and as a human? And the answer to that is clearly yes. Humans did survive that way for eons and eons. So when we adopt technologies, it's always a mixed picture. They bestow tremendous benefits on us, and they bestow epistemic risks on us. And never more have those epistemic risks been more serious than at present with the development of AI. So I totally agree with your point that although we might imagine in our fantasies, as Thoreau did, you know, living without or a very minimum of technology, if you want the benefits of technology, you must entertain the risks as well.
Thank you so much for the panel. This has been wonderful. Thank you for everyone who's come out. I'm thrilled by such a crowd for, you know, Wednesday night to hear kind of a talk like this. It means a lot. And please, we have books. The Loved One still has copies available. If you'd like to stay, get your copies signed, and maybe chat by the bar for a little bit and continue the conversation. Again, thank you so much, everyone. This has been wonderful.